Forward TV. The world is thinking.
When we were talking about this beforehand, we were quite keen to get this away from the equivalent of a sort of op-ed debate between, Charles Moore or some sort of pro-federalist. So whilst it's not going to be quite like Jerry Springer does EU constitutional reform, we are hoping this will be quite a lively debate and get away from some of the standard sort of tit-for-tat things that you tend to get in these sort of discussions. The thing is, the framing of the question is about what next for democracy in Europe, which should not be automatically assumed to be about what happens next to the EU constitution. That's very important. It also applies to the experience of democracy in all the European nations. So this covers, for example, the fact that the Polish election was swung by the fact that a huge amount of campaigning was done in the UK. Sarkozy did a lot of campaigning in London. We also have to take into account that there are very strong popular, I guess you could, grassroots politics in Hungary and Poland and many of the smaller Baltic states as well. So we're going to be taking quite a broad view. How we're going to do this is I'm going to start off first with Marc Glendening, who's director of the Democracy Movement. Then I'll be moving on to Tara McCormack, who's a lecturer in European Union Studies. And then to Marc Littlewood, who's one of the founders of Progressive Vision. They will be not speaking as a representative of that. They will be speaking for 5 to 7 minutes, and I'll be timing them strictly, and off we go with Marc.
Well, I remember a few years ago trying to engage Claire Fox on the issue of Europe, the sort of thing that swivel-eyed Euro-obsessives like Mark and myself periodically try to do. And she reacted to me in much the same way that I imagine Queen Victoria reacted to Lord Salisbury when he tried to raise the thorny issue of what to do about lesbianism. A sort of withering look and an abrupt change of topic. And I took the hint and we got back to discussing, Diana culture or whatever it was at the time. Now, I'm not saying that Claire and the millions of other people in Britain who find the European Union issue extremely tedious are now exactly gripped. But I think anybody interested in politics and where political power actually lies has to be it fleetingly, engaged with this issue. Because, of course, there is the issue of the Constitution and the way in which the peoples of Europe, with the one exception of Ireland, are being denied a direct say about this hugely important issue. And what does that say about the political culture of the time we live in? What does it say about the system of government that we as Europeans are being inexorably sucked into with all these treaty changes every few years that transfer more and more powers to the centre in Brussels? Now, Mark is going to accuse me of being a Eurosceptical hysteric when I say that the Constitution is the tipping point. It will be the treaty that establishes, probably for the first time, that the European Union now is the locus of decision-making power in the continent. In 2005, the German government confirmed in a parliamentary response to a Christian Democrat MP called Johannes Singhammer that out of 23,167 laws passed since 1998, 18,917 were the direct result of EU directives that national parliaments, of course, cannot but agree to pass into law. And so the Constitution, clearly by transferring yet another tranche of decision-making areas to the EU, is clearly going to add to that percentage of laws which originate in Brussels rather than from the elected national parliaments. I'm not an a priori believer in the nation-state, or in particular the United Kingdom. I think all man-made political constructs have to be subject to rational re-evaluation. Of course, that also includes the European Union. But there are three tests that I feel the emerging EU state fails, and I'm just going to very quickly list those to try to create debate. First of all, is there any overwhelming imperative why the diverse nations of Europe need to be forged into a single political entity? And a subsidiary to that is, what, if anything, should its boundaries be? I mean, should Turkey be part of the European Union? Russia? Should we have a border with Syria in Iraq? Does Marc, for example, see any limits to how big this political institution should be? Now, people who are keen on the idea of a federal Europe will often say, well, we need a Europe to speak with one big voice to take on Russia or America or Iran or whatever country they claim happens to be the sort of country that Europe needs to speak to with one voice. But I have to ask the question, what will this one voice say? What will it commit us to? And how will we as citizens in a political entity of over 500 million people, how will you and I have any kind of meaningful influence over what the European Union says with that one big voice? Simply identifying a range of issues that transcend national boundaries doesn't necessarily lead to the conclusion, I would argue, that the solution is to hand over yet more decision-making powers to Brussels, in particular when you look at its record in terms of the common agricultural policy and other areas of decision-making. Second, does the European Union need to have a single European people? Does this matter? I would say to Marc, get yourself a people before you build your fantasy EU state. Because if you do it the other way around, as Gisela Stewart, the Labour MP, who is campaigning for a referendum, has argued, this is really a recipe for great instability in Europe. Unless you have a political system that is underpinned by a sense of common political identity, unless that political system has legitimacy, then I think we're heading for, some pretty stormy waters, particularly with regard to the issue of immigration. Can you imagine Brussels determining that policy and imposing it upon electorates that have not yet given their legitimacy or their consent, rather, to be governed from Brussels? But there are a whole range of other serious issues that I think will emerge over the next 10 to 20 years, such as the pensions crisis and what have you. So I would like to see a referendum in all the EU member states. And if the peoples of Europe want this, then fine, they can have it. But first of all, we should be consulted before this project goes any further. And the last test I want to raise, will a united Europe better enable us to control the political elite? Will it help to mend the disconnect that exists between politics and the peoples of Europe? And again, I would ask you to look not at a fantasy EU, but the really existing political institutions of the European Union. I think we have enough problems in this country trying to keep the political class under some sort of control, and I think there are a whole range of reforms we need to accomplish in this country, such as more citizens' initiatives, direct democracy. But transferring powers to the European Union, which has a government that you and I cannot actually remove from office in any kind of meaningful election, I don't think is going to help us to achieve a re-engagement of the political process to the citizens of this or indeed other European countries. I'll shut up now.
Thank you very much. And over to Tom.
Okay, well, I don't know how provocative I'll be, so anyway, probably not particularly provocative. I guess the question we started thinking about, question of what next for democracy in Europe, as Martin said. And I think that this is a question really that can only be addressed firstly at the national level. I mean, I don't think there's any intrinsic reason why the EU couldn't be a democratic institution, genuinely, if European electorates agreed to establishing a proper union and were active participants in the process. I mean, I do agree with Marc that it is a question of establishing a kind of constitutive political body first, if this were to happen. But were it to happen, I don't think there should necessarily be limits, say, in terms of Turkey, for example, or other borders. However, at the moment, I think clearly there is a problem a problem of democracy within national states, and also in terms of the EU. And although I think they are related, I don't think that this is because, the EU is kind of sucking out democracy from nation states. I think this is more, if we think about the result of what we might call or we might see a sort of steady withdrawal of national political constituencies from domestic political life. But however, having said all that, I mean, I would argue that the European Union as it stands is a fairly undemocratic institution. And successive treaties, I think, as we all know, have withdrawn aspects of domestic policy, from the control of national governments and ultimately, of course, the national electorates. I mean, and I don't think that's a secret. That is and has been the point of the treaties. Each treaty has sought to erode the accountability of national political elites, and the Lisbon Treaty is essentially the same. But I think that has been an act of national political elites, not, say, of the the Commission kind of grabbing power from national political elites. And I think that's, to some extent, thinking about one of the other questions we're thinking about, we can see that the EU represents, rather than a kind of triumph of a kind of positive movement towards a supranational institution, which, as I said, I wouldn't see intrinsically any problem with. But the EU, as it is, actually represents the exhaustion of European political elites, and I think that's more the problem. That we see that political elites, domestic political elites, have kind of actively sought to hand over authority and accountability. But having said all that, to disagree with Mark, I don't think the Lisbon Treaty really represents a kind of decisive step towards a Euro superstate or a tipping point. And yes, it's true, I think, undeniably, that more areas have been taken out of the control of national governments, and national accountability has been further eroded. But I just want to say that in itself, I don't think that institutional changes, can necessarily kind of create a supranational polity, or indeed a supranational policy. And it seems to me this is something that's much more depends really on the political will of the governments of the member states. If we think about the idea of the foreign minister or the high representative, which many people are kind of in hysterics about, really we have to remember that the EU already conducts like a huge amount of foreign policy as the EU, from running Bosnia to transforming Turkey, aid trade, and so on. And this has all been done really without the aid of a foreign minister. When governments want to act together, they can do it. And finally, thinking about what next, again, maybe to disagree with Mark, I'm not really sure that there is a point at which, European sort of publics will finally sort of take to the streets to protest about the EU, because we really do see across Europe the most sort of phenomenal kind of lack of interest in the EU process. And I think probably some of this is deliberate on part of the domestic political elites who do like to negotiate these things kind of away from public scrutiny. But at the same time, there isn't really a clamour as well to kind of stop the EU, or even to, sort of much interest in the EU. So I'll leave it there and over.
That's great. Just one thing that occurred to me. Most of the crisis of elites we're talking about across Europe is national political elites. Most of the most exciting and radical and often dangerous politics in Europe is around the cities and local elections. And from a UK perspective, where local authorities and local government has almost no power, we tend to forget this. So one should not forget that much of the political anxiety about Europe is actually reflected in city and local elections, because the national political elites have largely bought into what you might call the EU establishment. And over to Mark.
Thank you, Martin. I'm keen to address Mr. Glendening's 3 tests in just a moment, but because I think that they are appropriate tests. But unlike him, I believe that you can tick each of the 3 boxes, and that is a justification for the creation of a united European Union. But I'd start from the question, what is the EU for? What is the purpose of it? And it strikes me that it has been created and is being developed out of a recognition of the almost complete irrelevance of national sovereignty in the modern era. It may well be the case that it was initially triggered by a reaction to the two world wars of the first half of the 20th century, but increasingly the world has changed in such a way that I believe that national sovereignty is a wholly irrelevant concept. It's a de jure concept, it's not a de facto concept. That what actually happens in France has direct and meaningful impact on our lives in the United Kingdom. So to ring-fence jurisdictions around nation-states, whether they are artificial creations or whether they do in fact represent some sort of cultural homogeneity, is simply an irrelevance. So that, if you like, addresses Marc's first test. Is there an overwhelming imperative for there to be a united Europe? I have to say, I'm not necessarily sure it's overwhelming. I mean, I think if the United Kingdom left the European Union, life would basically continue. I don't think it would be bad news for the United Kingdom, but I don't think that the walls would come crashing down. But there are good reasons and good imperatives for us to be part of the European Union. The example that I always like to trot out is a fairly obscure one, and I'm afraid I haven't refreshed my research on it, but it was the regulations relating to tractors in the EU prior to the creation of the single market. And you'll forgive me if I have some poetic licence here, because I may have forgotten the exact different regulations that existed in each member state. But they were something along the lines of as follows. In Belgium, if you wanted to legally sell a tractor, it had to have a 1/4 inch thick window pane on the front of it. Only applied in Belgium. If you wanted to sell a tractor in Belgium, it needed to have a particular thickness of glass. In Finland, if you wanted to sell a tractor, it had to have an escape hatch on the top of it. I mean, God only knows why. I don't know why you can just escape out of the door, but nevertheless, in Finland, you had to have an escape hatch on the top of it. There were particular regulations in Portugal about what the ratio had to be between the back wheels and the front wheels. And so it went on endlessly in each member state. There were different specifications and different regulations for what constituted a legal tractor that you could sell in the agricultural industry. Now, that actually prevented any sort of serious free market in the production or supply of tractors across the EU. It's not peculiar to tractors, I'm just giving you that as an example. The Single European Act has replaced all of that with one standard set of regulations about what constitutes a legal tractor in the European Union. So if you build a tractor which is fit for purpose in the UK, you can now sell it in Finland. If you build one which is fit for purpose in Belgium, you can sell it to the Danes. And this is true across the board, that free trade, in my view, is not enough, but what we actually need is a proper single market, because the experience prior to that was actually that you had free trade, but you had a whole set of national regulations which were effectively barriers to it, which were effectively designed to prop up the particular industries or particular prejudices or particular groups of people in each nation state. And that was a severe barrier to proper, free and genuine trade. So I think there is that overwhelming imperative. That's a simple matter of markets and trading. I think it's now increasingly clear that decisions made at the European Union level, whether we opt to have a seat round the table or not, have a meaningful and direct impact on our lives. I mean, the interest rate set by the European Central Bank is not a matter of supreme irrelevance to the economy of the United Kingdom. Far from it. It has an extremely meaningful impact on the economy of the United Kingdom. So there are more and more things which tie us together, in which I believe that even if you don't buy that the imperative is overwhelming, there is at least some form of communality of interest. And the European Union is the first early teetering, sometimes faltering steps to create an institutional structure which recognises that reality on the ground. Mark's second issue was, do we need a European demos, or a sort of shared, united political culture in which, I don't quite know how it would be expressed, presumably we all wave the blue flag with the 12 stars on it and cheer us on in the Ryder Cup golf against the Americans. I'm not sure what the expression of it would be, but that there needs to be some sort of European demos before you can create some sort of united Europe. I think there already is some form of European demos. But I also think that, if you like, cultural homogeneity within each nation state is breaking down quite considerably. I probably have more in common with a middle-class 30-something white Parisian man than I do with an unemployed industrial worker from the northeast of England. And I think the idea that we can parcel up into the different nation states some form of homogeneity which doesn't exist across borders, I think, is false. Will a united Europe enable us to actually hold the elites to account better? Potentially, yes. I think that does depend on the exact nature of the Constitution, which I readily accept is nothing like as democratic and transparent as it should be. I'd like to see considerable reform in it being opened up and being more directly accountable to the citizen. But there's almost, because of my point about national sovereignty, it's almost irrelevant to hold national domestic political elites to account. I mean, if you look at something like the Northern Rock crisis, there's some extent to which it was the crisis was born and bred in the United Kingdom, but to some considerable extent we're at the mercy of international economic forces. What is the point of being able to hold the British domestic political elite to account if they are actually not in full control of the events that actually affect our country? It doesn't follow from that. It's going to be easier with the particular rules we've got to hold to account the European Commission President, but at least that would be somebody who would have considerably more influence over the affairs that affect us. The expansion of the European Union, in my view, requires a deepening if you want it to be effective, and Mark probably doesn't, but if having a European Union of 6 countries, of which one is Luxembourg, it's quite easy to get unanimity around the table. 20 to 30 countries, quite impossible to get unanimity around the table. So if you actually want to embed a structure in which, say, Malta could unilaterally veto in a Europe-wide decision, then the EU will be ineffective. So the expansion of the EU frankly necessitates a move away from the national veto and towards majority voting if you want the EU to do anything effective at all. Where's this leave democracy for us? I think that Mark, in his extremely predictable pamphlet about the need for a referendum on the European Constitution, is actually missing the point. I'm not wholly opposed to a referendum on the treaty.
Are you for it?
I don't mind either way. I don't have a stance either way. I don't know whether I'm for or against a referendum on capital punishment. I mean, it doesn't strike me that there's a fundamental need for it. I'm not fundamentally opposed to there being a referendum. I think it's a problem for Gordon Brown and the Labour Party.
Do you want it or not?
Do I want a referendum?
Do you want the treaty?
Yes. Oh, definitely. I want the treaty ratified.
And you don't think people should
excuse me, can we, you have to stop now, Mark, because we've run
Can
over.
I? That's it? Okay. I can't even finish my sentence.
We've only got 20 minutes. With the deal is that in your packs there's directions to the Royal College of Music. I think that's it, round the back, so it's like 5 minutes walk away. I'm very keen for you not just to respond to the speakers, but in very short, concise questions or comments. Say also what you think we're going to look for in Europe. I mean, sorry, I sound like this is the mark of a nutter reaching into his shopping bag. But you find, I mean, it's my pre-reading, but you'll find a respected German historian like Walter Lacker, who's been writing about European politics for over 50 years now, writing The Last Days of Europe, Epitaph for an Old Continent, where he thinks much of our democracy and a European sensibility is going to be swallowed up by the demographics of Muslim immigration or existing. Now there are lots of New Age new Spanglers out there predicting doom, and there are some, but curiously there aren't many people who are wildly optimistic about Europe. So I'm really keen to hear your responses to this, and hopefully get away from the sort of things you might otherwise come across in the letters pages of the Guardian or the Daily Telegraph. Okay, gentleman at the back. I'll actually take 3, so make it really quick and then we'll respond. Gentleman at the back first.
Chris Bickerton, University of Oxford. I just wanted to sort of address both the first and the third speaker, because I think neither of you have got it right, but one provides the answer to the other. So I think, Mark, I think you get it wrong in the sense that if there's one thing that defines the current sort of treaty writing process, and it was a feature of the Constitutional Treaty and it's been consolidated and deepened in the Reform Treaty, it's not that power is being sort of sucked up by Brussels. It's not that power is being transferred to Brussels. What defines these treaties is that states are reasserting their control over the European integration process. That's what's distinctive about it. And even the pro-Europeans that you read in the press, they all recognize that, yes, the federal moment is over. We're not moving towards a federal superstate. This is what these treaties say to us. But the problem is that this presents us with a contradiction, which is at the same time as states are reasserting their control over the integration process, the idea that there's a democratic deficit is growing and growing and growing. Now, how can we explain that? Now, the only answer for that is exactly what was provided by the third speaker, which is that the real problem is that whether or not states reassert their control over Brussels doesn't matter, because the problem is the lack of belief on the part of national populations that their own representatives can adequately represent them in Brussels. So even if states take control, it's our mistrust with our national representatives that's really the problem. And that's about national democracy. And your ambivalence over the referendum, and your idea, I don't know where you got it from, that national sovereignty is somehow irrelevant in Europe today, that just says it all. There's a complete disregard for processes of national representation, which is exactly why the European integration process, in whatever direction it goes, will always be seen as deepening the democratic deficit.
Okay, thank you. Woman in pink, and then gentleman next to her.
Thank you. I was one of the early members of the Bruges group, which is very much against the Maastricht Treaty, and unfortunately we lost our battle over having a referendum on that. And again, a lot of it was to do with the political unconsciousness of this country and how very little information was given to the general public about the fact that what we were talking about is not a free trade union. I'm all for that. What we're talking about is political union. Also, the way that Brussels works, if I may just put this in, because I think from what I was hearing, it didn't sound as though some of the speakers quite understood, is that there's a council of ministers, there's the bureaucracy in Brussels, so they're just the bureaucrats. The council of the European Union are made up of the ministers of each country that is a member, and each one of them has their responsibility, whether it's for foreign affairs or whatever the question is that's being discussed. What has happened, and where the real fundamental, to my mind, problems have come, is in the erosion of the right to have the right of veto. Because it means that other countries, without having voted for by us, means that their ministers can impose what they want on our country. And this, I think, is totally and utterly wrong. And so that is what I, really believe in, and that is where we are totally losing democracy, when you don't have a right of veto. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman, sir.
Is there any point in discussing the structure of the EU if we can't actually decide whether we want to be in it or not? I'm very pro-European, but I don't think most people actually care either way in the Constitution. They're not voting on that. It's basically, there should be a referendum whether you stay in or not.
Okay, can we go to responses now? For fairly short ones, and you don't have to say anything if you don't want to, but...
Okay, very quickly.
And any new points that you'd want to add following hearing what other people say?
I disagree profoundly with what you said about this treaty not concentrating more powers. In my very predictable pamphlet, which you'll find on the table over there, it gives a list, a whole range of areas, from criminal justice to energy, to a whole variety of transport, very important subjects, which apparently national systems of government are totally incapable of making meaningful decisions about, according to Marc, which will be transferred, as the lady from the Bruges Group said here, to qualified majority voting, which will mean that these decisions will be taken collectively by the Council of Ministers, which is the main legislature of the European Union, together with the executive, the Commission, which has the monopoly right to initiate legislation, though it's unelected. So these transfers of power, together, of course, with all the transfers of power within the Nice Treaty, the Amsterdam Treaty, and all the others, mean that laws can be imposed upon electorates who have no capacity to really debate these laws and to reverse them democratically if that is what they want to do. Now, I wouldn't have a problem with that if the people had given their consent to be governed at this level. And this brings me back to the point Marc said when he said, well, how are we to know if the peoples of Europe want to be governed by a pan-European system of government? Is it a question of cheering for the Ryder Cup team? No, it's a question of voting in a referendum to transfer powers from one constitution to another. That's the simple test. Do the peoples of France, Ireland, Britain, Poland, and the rest want that or not? So there is a democratic deficit, and it's being made worse. But I agree that there are democratic problems within this country and within France and all the other EU countries, but we're not going to solve those problems by this ever-centralising trajectory of the European Union.
Before the other people, nor are we going to solve these problems by constantly banging on about the EU as the only problem that we have, or the major problem.
No, I agree.
I think you give one vote.
Very quickly on those, Chris, I think it was from Oxford Universities. I agree with a lot of your analysis. I think one of the problems about the EU at the moment is it actually has the characteristics of a confederation of nation states, rather than a federation of the sovereignty of the people. I mean, actually, what I think is dangerous about it is the extreme power of the Council of Ministers, in which the idea that the British interest is represented by a British representative and the French interest by a French representative, in my view, is nothing like as sensitive to the democratic necessities as a more direct representation of the peoples of Europe. I fear you may be right that the prospects of moving to a federation are considerably lower now than they were 30 or 40 years ago, but that doesn't prevent me from arguing for it. I think that would be the solution. On the question of the national veto that the lady raised at the front, I mean, I can understand why you may wish to retain a national veto, but I don't believe it is fundamental to a democratic principle whether you have a veto or not. It strikes me as just as democratic to have 20 people in a room who agree that a two-thirds majority will carry something, as it does to have 20 people in a room who agree a system where all 20 need to vote for something. And the actual...
That is democratic either.
Well, I think it's perfectly
Sorry.
I think it's perfectly democratic to agree. I mean, you know, in the Houses of Parliament there are 650 odd MPs. Not each one of the 650 has a veto. Where I'm from, a Conservative MP was elected. He doesn't have a veto. He has to accept. He has one vote, and there's no reason. There is no fundamental reason about democracy as to why that cannot be applied at European level. On the referendum question, stay in or stay out, I'm essentially, if you like, from a point of principle, indifferent on the referendum question. But I do take a view that if you're going to have a referendum, it has to say yes to something. It might be that you say yes to withdrawal from the EU. I mean, that's actually a positive, quote-unquote, decision. What I don't think you can have is a referendum saying, do you like this treaty, yes or no? I mean, if you vote no, what do you actually want in its place? Do you want to leave? Which bits do you want altered? So it needs to actually come out with an affirmative answer. So if there was to be a referendum, I would favour a question along the lines of the 1975 referendum. Given the changes to our membership of the EU, do you wish Britain to remain a member of it, yes or no? And that's right, if people vote no, then the government would then presumably have to negotiate our withdrawal. What we mustn't have is a sort of, do you like this treaty, yes or no? And the interesting thing that Mark's groups, the Eurosceptic groups always complain about, if a country votes no to a treaty, then the political elites go back and say, well, think again. But of course you've eventually got to say yes to something. The initial Danish no vote to the Maastricht Treaty, I think, was carried by a majority of about 20 or 30,000 in total across the country. There was a very vociferous, albeit rather small, federalist group who were arguing that you should vote no to the Maastricht Treaty because it was not federalist enough. You could make a good cephalological claim that those federalists were actually decisive in voting no, and therefore the 50.5% who voted no actually had no coherent view about where they wanted to go.
Thank you, Mark. Tara?
Okay, well, just a couple of points, I guess, to some things that Marc Littlewood was saying. I mean, I do think there is a problem with arguing that national politics are irrelevant, and I'd agree with Chris's contribution, and it seems to me to argue that just really evades the problems both of, national democracy and the relationship, say, between national states and the EU. And secondly, I was just going to say, it's good that tractors are all standardised, but, I just don't think that's going to do it to sort of make the EU a legitimate project. I just don't think that's going to kind of stir people and bring about a kind of European political...
Well, it's interesting to say, I mean, the problem is that in some ways my side of the argument would benefit from a more emotive pro-European sense, but I don't think we should try and whip that up in some sort of King Jong-il style fashion. I think the actual necessity, the actual truth of the matter is that there are actually very practical, rather tedious communalities of interest, which I don't necessarily expect people to be shouting from the rafters about, but are nevertheless genuine, rational things that actually unite us. And a single, not just free trade area, but a single market is an element of those. It might not get the crowds in the streets, but it's still a fundamental impact to our day-to-day lives.
I'm very grateful for your point about the overwhelming imperative for Europe being tractor harmonisation. But it raises a good point, actually. There's an issue that most of what the EU does is staggeringly boring by necessity. The EU, in terms of all these laws, it's primarily a standard-setting institution. Much of what it does is technical, though much of that has very big consequences. But we want to talk about it as a political project because that's sexier. The second thing is the gentleman at the front talked about being pro-European. That phrase I've not heard for a long time. And it's quite odd because a lot of, quotes, pro-Europeans do not want Turkey in the EU. Some pro-Europeans, self-styled pro-Europeans, do want Turkey in the EU. I think it's no longer very obvious what being pro-European is. It used to be more widening, more deepening, more of everything, and that's gone. Right, we've only got about 7 minutes left. I want 2 brisk, exciting contributions, and then I want a quick wrap-up by the speakers. So please, brisk and exciting. Woman to the right, she had her hand up.
Yes, hello. I live in France, and we voted against the referendum in 2005, I think it was, yes. We were very, very well informed about the content of the referendum, and that was extremely important. This meant that there was a connection, a social connection between the people. There were citizens' initiatives, there were meetings, discussions on a very, very national level. I think this treaty is very, very problematic because it is not free of a political bias. It's not neutral. By definition, a constitution should be free of political bias. And I think that what we need desperately in Europe is a social Europe. That's what's missing. And then one way of creating a social Europe is to get social movements, people initiating projects and communicating with each other. And one way of doing that is being able to vote for a referendum, to have the right to vote. So I'm very much for the referendum, from my own experience.
Okay. Though rather glibly on the issue of social Europe, I often think this is more a matter of cheap flights than any EU activity. Gentleman at the back, sorry, with the beard.
I think one of the things about Europe is that it's missed its opportunity in the sense that it was started as a project in the 50s or before, but it's now trying to be formed in a world which is so interconnected by media flows that it's an intermediate form. And that seems to explain why it's become a sort of ghost project that its enthusiasts keep trying to fill with a sort of culturally engineered Europeans, so that once the Maastricht Treaty got almost rejected by a majority of states, we suddenly had this process of Europe Days and a song for Europe and the European flag and all this. It's like Brecht's old point about the East German people, that they'd lost the confidence of the government, so the government would have to elect new people. So that seems to me what's happened, and it seems to me that is always going to be the case with Europe. That there's never, if you've got a global, if you live in a space where your TV and media flows are global, where you're interconnected by the internet, where people fly to New York for their shopping or they holiday in Thailand or so forth and so on, then Europe is a middle-sized form which is already ceasing to exist as a distinct sort of form. So I don't think we're ever going to get this point of an actual social Europe.
Yeah. I like the Ghost Project thing, and I also must use a train metaphor, which was popular in European debates. It's like the European project is a big train, but everybody's decided to take the plane. And different planes, by the way. That's a really torture metaphor. There was another...
There's a guy over there.
Sorry? Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. As someone who actually works for the Ghost Project in something that I would say is distinctly real, working in the border security between Ukraine and Moldova, being on an EU Commission mission on the ground there with police, border guard and customs officers from all over Europe, I can certainly see practical benefits to working together in that regard to deal with problems that directly affect Eastern members of the European Union, but have a very significant knock-on effect for all of us. And this is exactly the point of the European Union, this overriding reason for its existence, if you like, is that we do live in this globalized world that was described by the gentleman behind me, and the European Union is a consolidated effort to deal with that and to actually rise above the nation-state model, which is frankly dated and shows that nation-states are too big to deal with local problems and too small to deal with global problems. The European Union provides a framework for empowering local politics within an umbrella organization of security, stability, and good governance. It passes powers up to the supranational level when that is appropriate. The principle of subsidiarity, i.e. decision-taking at the lowest possible level, still stands true within the European Union, and whether that means at the local level, regional level, national level, or Commission level, that is the way it works. Okay. Regarding federalism and intergovernmentalism, I think it would be a very big shame if the European Union did go down a federal route, because I then think you're just creating a bigger quasi-nation state. I think the value of the European Union lies exactly in its diversity, and in the fact it provides a scope for difference and a scope for conversation on a big political level. That is really unique in the world as a political organization and a political entity, and an experiment, frankly. And yes, things do go wrong because it is an experiment. More, just very quickly to finish that off. The fact it does provide this post-national or post-modern organization of states, as Robert Cooper refers to it, shows that there is hope for value-driven politics as opposed to just the politics of the market. And I think that's something very important that we need to not lose sight of when discussing the European Union.
Okay,
thank you.
That's the final point. Sorry, we haven't got time for any others. Summing up and responses from the speakers, please. Mark?
Right, okay, very quickly. France, I think your point is really important, that the Constitution actually commits the Union to a whole variety of policies. Now, some of them, talking about postmodernism, are completely contradictory. So, in fact, it's difficult to know exactly what is the political bias. But in some parts of the Constitution, the treaty, it talks about movement towards a free market. Well, what if you don't want a free market? What if the voters of Belgium don't want a free trade in tractors? What if they want protectionism? So why should a constitution have any kind of political impulse within it? It should be according to modernist and European Enlightenment democratic values. A constitution should be completely value neutral. It should just be about the rules, the engagement between the citizen and the state. So there's that point, which I think is a very important one, that this commits us to a whole range of policies, regardless of what they are. In a liberal modernist democracy, that should not happen. The second point from the gentleman at the back I thought was very important about why the EU is in fact now an outdated sort of model. I mean, it's the product of 1930s, 40s, 50s, thinking about big is best, aggregating power in sort of central committees that then impose a one-size-fits-all model of government, contrary to what the gentleman said earlier, in a very centralizing, top-down sort of a way. This, I think, is very out of date in a global world, where in fact what is more important is speed of response and flexibility to changing international circumstances. And anybody would have thought, listening to his interesting comments, that any form of international cooperation is impossible between sovereign, independent political entities, that you have to subordinate your political system to some sort of supranational body, which is legally supreme. Well, the vast majority of the countries of the world have not done that. Even within Europe, some countries such as Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, and others have chosen not to do that. Yet these countries do cooperate internationally through Interpol and other bodies, through the United Nations, and of course they have freedom of trade. So Marc's argument that you have to have this extraordinary sort of Byzantine postmodern bureaucracy in order to have international freedom of trade is simply empirically not the case. There are more modern and more flexible forms of international cooperation available.
Okay, Tara?
Okay, well, I suppose just quickly on the idea of this sort of great political conversation that we're meant to be having on Europe. I mean, I've heard this a lot, you know, sort of from European elites, but I have to say it strikes me that the Constitutional Treaty was exactly the evasion of any kind of political conversation on trying to kind of take European publics along. And it was much more about trying to present as, you know, a kind of fait accompli, as if the political constituency already existed. So, you know, I wish we could have this great political conversation, but it doesn't seem to be happening. And just finally, I guess I'll take a sort of boring third way between my two panelists and say, I don't think the EU is going to be a sort of panacea to the problems of national democracy. I think that's something that has to be sorted out at the national level. But again, neither do I see it as it is, as a kind of European superstate at the moment. So.
Okay, Mark?
Interesting point on the Constitution. I actually don't buy the idea that a Constitution can be value neutral. I mean, I can tell you the political values I want in my Constitution. They're universal suffrage. I mean, you could have a Constitution that excludes women from voting, for example. The values that I want embedded into the Constitution are liberal democratic values. I don't believe that you can have a Constitution which doesn't have political value in it. It's an intrinsically political document. Interesting point that the lady made about the referendum in France, and this goes to my point about the problem of what's meant by a no. In broad terms, I'm generalising to some degree, the argument in France was that, oh my God, the EU is going to become some sort of rampant free market Thatcherite project. Whereas the no campaign in the United Kingdom, generally policed by rampant free market Thatcherites, is, oh my God, the European Union is going to become this sort of socialist entity.
That's not the argument.
Both arguments are put in different places to justify a no vote. Well, on the one hand, it's too free market. On the one hand, and I think that's a problem about the coherence of what the Eurosceptics want. Globalisation, freedom of trade. Mark's right. There's no actual reason why you couldn't have hundreds of nation states with free trade. But the European Union proposition is more intense than that. It's actually a single market. And I readily accept that's a more intense arrangement. You could have a looser free trade arrangement, but I think there are considerable benefits to be drawn by having a more intense arrangement. Where will we be in 10 years' time? I'm not wholly optimistic. I mean, I'm not addicted to the EU institutionally, and I think it may fail. I think that the democratic deficit is a serious problem, and if it is not addressed, I think the citizens of Europe will understandably revolt against the present structure. So I'm not wedded to the present structure. I hope it succeeds, because I believe that the creation of international and supranational institutions is a benefit. But where I'm certain that we'll be in 10 years' time, because it's where I've been with Mark over the past 10 years, is whatever new reforms and ideas are brought forward to the European Union process, Mark will claim that this is the tipping point, and if this one goes through, the United Kingdom really is finished. He said that, I think, about the Maastricht Treaty, about the Nice Treaty, about the Amsterdam Treaty, and now about the Reform Treaty. I'm very confident he will be consistent in saying that about all future treaties that are brought forward.
Yes, in Jerry Springer style, I would start sitting behind me, and a very large man with a thick neck and a tracksuit. Yeah. Thank you ever so much. The Chair's prerogative, and the final point is that one of the odd things about the debate about the EU is that people very rarely say what success looks like or what failure looks like when either side have actually achieved it or not. Thank you ever so much for coming along tonight.